Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get going shortly. Just a reminder, if you can all be on mute, please just take a second just to check you're on mute. Very happy if you leave your cameras on, but turn it off if you wish. And in fact, this particular talk, in fact, not just this individual one, but actually the this little mini series of three are very good, I think, for open discussions. So um, as I'm going through, if you have any particular experiences or comments of your own that you'd like to share, please do come off mute and put your camera on and chip in and join in the chat. I think that's always a good way to do these CPD things. So it's 4 o'clock on my, just check that. Yep, 4 o'clock, and let's get going. Joey, if I see you're there, if you could just turn on to mute, please, just so we don't get any background phone calls, noise, chatter, dogs barking, all that sort of stuff. Be very nice if you could just put yourself on mute, and everybody else. Right, okay, so let's crack on with it. So this is a little mini series of three talks we're doing on damp issues. And those of you who've done these CPD things with me before will know that I've often said that the two highest sources of complaints that surveyors get, whether that means a complaint that's just a stroppy email from a client or whether it's something that actually develops further into an actual claim or something more formal. The two things which are literally at the top of the list, of every list, year in, year out. Number one will be valuations, but we're not here to talk about valuations. And number two on the list, very close behind it, is damp. Anything to do with damp or the consequences of damp. And it is a regular issue. It doesn't matter how old the house is, whether it's brand new, 20, 30 years, Victorian, listed, old, whatever. It doesn't matter. Problem is that there seems to be this gap and this imbalance between what surveyors observe and say in their reports and what clients are hearing when they read that text or they are discussing with the client directly. So we're going to cover all of that over the next three talks. So the reason for it is quite simply that it's one of those high risk issues. So thank you very much for joining us. And you would have come here, as I say, always say at the beginning of these talks, via the CBCS website, where we've got all of our on-demand content. You know, there's nearly 30 hours of on-demand content available now. It's building up, and indeed this next run of talks will also be on there. And we've got additional ones which are not on there that I'm in the process of updating, and those we'll redo those in the autumn. So there's considerable volume of online content. Just to remind you, if you are nearer the early career or you're still a student, if you're at that stage in your career where you're still learning, and we all had to learn at some point, then on Friday, that's Friday this week, I think there's still a couple of places visit for our in-person training day in Southsea. Southsea's near Portsmouth. Going to two houses. One of those is the one on that title image. Two houses within walking distance, and it's a sort of a practical training day to give you some real life experience of doing more than one survey in a day and all the things that you need to consider when you're in that type of high pressured rapid turnover report environment. So if that might be you or of interest to you, I think there's still a couple of places visits. That's Friday this week. So this is the first of three talks on the damp issues that I've just said. We're looking today at a general selection and giving you some pointers of how to talk to your client. At the end of this talk, we'll look at client communication, report writing, and I think it will become self-evident why we're doing that as we get through. And then on Thursday, we're looking at the issues of mold and lack of ventilation, and then next week looking at basements and so forth. So that's all a little package of three. And then we've got 15 hours, which I've bundled into three groups of five, looking at essentially 300 years of housing. And we're going to work back chronologically. So, starting with 20th century housing issues, housing, why buildings are like they are, how they've, an architecture and standards has progressed during the 20th century. You see the titles on screen there. I think it's a really fascinating insight into the buildings that we all get to see in on a day-to-day basis. Then after that, we've got five talks. I'm just putting the dates together. These will all be in July. Five talks on Victorian housing. Going to just breach over into early 1900s, but essentially Victorian housing. You'll see the talks there. I think the third one on that list will be particularly useful and interesting. So that's going to be a little package of five, all on Victorian housing. And then we'll conclude the series on Georgian housing. And you see the titles there. So we're going to take you through essentially 300 years of housing, construction, design, use, what's happened to them, how people change and adapt them, and therefore all the things that we end up doing as surveyors, and we end up seeing and having to report on what the consequences of all that is and why they ended up being like they are. So should be a really interesting three packages of brand new innovative CPD. Okay, so the building tells a story. I think this is a really interesting photograph. So it's good that it looks in black and white. And I think this somewhat summarizes what we do as surveyors. The building's telling a story. Are we listening? If you've ever seen Mastermind on TV, the session where people are asked questions on their favorite subject and then they have a general knowledge thing, right? The people who do better than others, or mostly better than others on those programs, are those who choose books or works by authors. And that's quite, interesting, but it's also quite obvious because there is a certain number of pages and words in those volumes that actually the questions can be asked on. So if you are a particular expert on Jane Austen or whoever it might be, and you read every book ever written by that author and you interrogate it inside and out, there is a limited amount of information there. So when we, as surveyors, look at buildings, it's actually not that dissimilar. When you go to look at any one particular house or a building, it doesn't have to be a house, but in this case, we are talking about houses. Go and look at any one particular house. It is a finite entity in its own right. The building tells a story of its architecture, of its current user and former users. And it is limited in that we're not looking at every house in the road. We're looking at that one specific building. So as surveyors, we have a captive amount of information that we have access to accumulate. And there are problems doing that type of work. There are sometimes parts of the building we can't see. Sometimes we might need to make a recommendation for a further investigation or whatever. We're going to get onto that shortly. But essentially, it is a package. And I've often said, and I think some other people have said this as well, as a surveyor, we are part doctor, part detective. The doctor part is to look at the building from a building pathology perspective. We're looking out for defects. We're looking for how someone has looked after it. Maybe a repair has been done fairly recently and it might be superficially in good condition now, but it might not have been done correctly. So we might want to comment on that qualitative assessment. But also, it's not just that we are there to try to understand the building and try to understand what's happened to it and what is likely to happen to it in the future. And our client relies on us for that sort of two-pronged approach. We're looking for evidence of what those defects might be, and we're looking to think what that might have caused those defects and how that might work going forward. And our client is going to be relying on us for all of that information. And we are quite lucky that we have this captive amount of a building at any one time that we can look at. Now, how many of you have often been to a house, and I'm sure every single one on this call, and those of you who are joining on catch up and everything else, how often you've been to a house where someone has been there before you, someone has been there before you and already made a diagnosis. Maybe you've been told by the client, oh, we know it's got rising damp, or we know it's got this, that, or the other. Someone has been there before you and is effectively prompting you with some form of diagnosis. And even more the case is you get there doing your inspection, and in the case of damp, it's already got those injection holes along the bottom of the wall, or maybe it's got Shriver tubes or whatever. It's already, someone has been there and had a go at it already. So the purpose of this talk and the next two that follow up, what we are going to be doing, we are looking for the evidence, and we're looking for how we can then understand what has happened to that building through the evidence, and how we then communicate that to our client. And essentially, that is what this image is saying. The building is telling us the information. It's our job as a surveyor to interpret that information and then communicate it to our client. So there are multiple different ways that this plays out in the real world, and I'm going to go through a number of example photographs, all of which I'm sure you'll either have seen examples like this during your own work. And let's just think about what is actually happening here. So we're looking at this one image of some damaged plasterwork and paintwork at the lower part of the wall near the skirting. So what is the building telling us, and what does this image tell us that we can learn and that we can then communicate to our client? Well, what do we see? We see it's got a fairly modern skirting. The flooring itself is fairly modern, ceramic tiles with that black grouting that we often see. And that alone will tell you this is a building probably had one of those doer-uppers, or a bit of DIY has happened to it. Now, that plaster you're looking at there is gypsum plaster. And those of you who are familiar with how damp moves within buildings will know that gypsum is not like lime. Gypsum will hold on to moisture. It's far more susceptible to showing us some damp evidence, and the paint particularly. And if we look closely at this image with that edge of the paint, how it's peeling off, this is essentially telling us that there is or has been some moisture in that wall, and that lower part of that gypsum is certainly darker than the upper part. Now, it's very easy to jump to a conclusion and say, well, this building has got rising damp, therefore you now need to do XYZ. And that XYZ often might include getting another inspection, or going to get some quotes for remedial damp proofing and so forth. And we've done other talks, and if you haven't already done one of those with us or with someone else, we've got other talks on the website on that diagnostic style. But I'd like you to think about this in a slightly different way. That is effectively jumping to the conclusion. What we've missed out at this point is looking for the evidence of what is causing, or what might have caused, this bit of damp mark on this wall. And this is the whole theme of what we are talking about now, because otherwise we can end up in a situation where we've made the conclusion before we actually understand what is actually going on with the building pathology and what might have occurred. I mean, for example, this might be an outside wall, but it also might be an internal wall. What we're looking at there might have been caused by something done on the neighbour's side of the wall, and not necessarily on our side of the wall as doing this inspection just from this one point of view. So when we are looking at something like this, I'm trying to get you to think about not jumping to the conclusion straight away, but to looking for potential evidence that might have caused this. Now, in this one single image, it's very difficult to actually form any opinion at all, because we're seeing it out of context. But when you're doing your survey, you'll be at the building, you can try to walk around the whole building, and I'm sure if you've got some evidence like this, it won't be isolated, it won't be the only evidence in in the situation. And an example of this might be where someone has gone there before you. Maybe a valuer, a mortgage valuer, has been there, and you're there to do the survey, maybe the level 2 or level 3 survey, and are being prompted to go and get a timber and damp report, or you are prompting your client to go and get a timber and damp report. And I think we should be very mindful that there's a lot of sales driven motives behind a lot of that type of work, and actually our clients now are more clued up on these things than they perhaps used to be, and we should be trying to give them a more holistic viewpoint. So that's one example. Let's look at another example, and this is how moisture meters are used. I'm sure everybody will at some point, and probably still do, you're doing an inspection and you'll take an image like this with your hand holding your moisture meter on the wall. And often this is used as evidence to say you've got some damp in this building, or sometimes it's used to protect yourself from some form of liability issue by demonstrating that you have actually done some moisture inspections. And of course, let's remember, if those of you who are RICS surveyors are obligated in the Home Survey Standard. In fact, actually, the new version that might be forthcoming at some point later this year, the second edition of the Home Survey Standard, actually stipulates that you should be doing this at very regular intervals, different heights above the floor, and you should actually be reporting on the locations, not just your comments or observations like this one photograph, but actually in a bit more detail. So there's an obligation there through the Home Survey Standard. But even if you're not an RICS surveyor, or you're just learning about this generally, surveyors are quite good at putting these types of photos in. But do remember that moisture meter is not diagnosing the damp issues. What it is doing, it's giving you a bit of information about something that you can't see with your own eyes. And we need to be also very mindful that these moisture meters, and the one I've got in my hand there is a Proteometer, but of course there are other makes on the market. They are a useful diagnostic tool, but they are not a laboratory calibrated piece of equipment, and you should never really, if you're being very careful about it, never actually say that you've measured anything. You're not measuring anything. You're trying to assess whether there is or isn't any evidence of moisture in that wall, and these things can be influenced by lots of things, particularly like foil back plasterboard, electrical cables, salts in the walls, and so forth. So do be mindful of that these are not diagnosing the damp, they are simply drawing it to your attention. And in the same way, that an analogy for you to think about is how a thermometer works. A thermometer will measure your body temperature, but it's not telling you whether you have the flu or a cold, is it? It is simply a diagnostic tool. So we need to be mindful of that and think about our use of moisture meters in the same way, that they are a diagnostic tool which might help you, but let's not rely on them overly too much. And those of you who might end up in a dispute at a later date, if you have put far too much reliance on those moisture meters, you will be questioned on that, I'm sure, by the opposing side. Right, what about something like this? It's a close-up of a wall with some salts shown on the wall. What is this telling us? Well, it is telling us there's a wall with some salts on it. It is not telling us why those salts are there. We could look further into the building, and maybe this might be associated with the previous image I've just shown you, that perhaps there is an issue of some moisture in the lower part of the wall that requires further investigation. But just based on one image alone, we shouldn't necessarily be putting a greater degree of reliance on it being a major problem just because it salts on. So what is it that the building is trying to tell us in this instance, and what can we learn from it? And what it's trying to tell us is that there is, or there has been, some moisture in this wall for reasons as yet unknown that has then evaporated out and then has left the salts on the wall. At its simplest point, that is all we can deduce from that. We can't form any greater level of opinion without doing some further inspections. And I think this is something that I've definitely talked about. In fact, we had a whole talk on further investigations some months ago. This is something I think that surveyors often say in their surveys, but I'm not entirely sure that clients probably listen or follow up those recommendations for further investigations. And where something like this is concerned, rather than saying a further inspection or further investigation is go and get a quote for looking at it, perhaps there's an intermediary step to do a little bit of opening up to find out if it's not obvious from other parts of the wall or other parts of the building. When I say obvious, I mean obvious to you as a surveyor, not necessarily obvious to your client. If it's not obvious to you why that piece of wall or the whole wall has got damp, then before jumping to some conclusion, it would be absolutely right and proper to make a suggestion, a recommendation for doing some opening up works, that part of further investigation, and to say and be very specific that you're not allowed to do that during your survey. It's out of the scope of doing your initial survey, and that you being very specific as to what you're asking, where in the building you're making that recommendation, and when. And if this is a pre-purchase inspection, as many of you will be doing pre-purchase inspections, then surely that should be at least investigated before exchange of contracts. So there's this intermediary state. Now, it can get even more interesting than that, is that as a surveyor, we go on our own to see these buildings. What if, let's say, three, four, five surveyors went in to the same building and saw exactly the same defect? In this case, we're looking at salts on the wall. Would we all make the same recommendation? Would we all come up with the same advice to our client, our same observations? The observations are going to be the same. We're all going to take this one single photograph. But I would hazard a guess that probably out of five surveyors going in there, we wouldn't get the same response going forward. And that's something we'll come back to a bit later in this talk. But it's something worth thinking about as to why that is. Why is it that as surveyors we do have a variable viewpoint and variable opinion on certain things? Not necessarily a variable opinion on its diagnosis, but a very variable opinion on how to report it and the words, and in terms of giving it some level of priority. Towards the end of this talk, I'm going to talk about condition ratings. Those of you who do those reports that use the traffic light, the color-coded CR123s, we're going to come on to that. And when we get towards that, I'd like to just think about how you make your own decisions on these sort of diagnostic things. Okay, what about something like this? A skirting internal, you can see the floor there. It's a fairly modern laminate floor. Someone's been in the building, probably done some work, and you can get that immediate just from that one point. We can see the little bit of bead around the edge to hide that very awkward gap that you get when people have done laminate. You can always get it in to a certain point, but you can never get it right up to the wall and right under the skirting. So putting these little beads is a good way of hiding that little gap. So we're looking at a building which has had a bit of work done to it, and now we've got some crinkled skirting. What do we think's going on there? Well, we would be in a position at this point to put our protimeter, whatever, into that, and I think you don't even really need to do that. You can see that the skirting has had some decay and has got some rot in it, and that there's something going on. What is the building telling us from this one single observation? What we are able to deduce from this, of course, is that there is moisture in that skirting board, which means that that moisture is likely to have come from the wall which is immediately behind it. And as surveyors, we should be questioning why that is the case, where that moisture has come from. And in fact, actually, has it or could it have led to far more severe timber decay beyond this one single image? So if you're seeing this in your survey, you will be hopefully you'll have your interest piqued, and then you'll be looking elsewhere. But every single one of these these images I'm showing you should always be trying to make you think as to what the building's trying to tell us and what we then can learn from that and how we're going to report that to our client. So what about something like this, where we've got a mold growing, in this case, on the back of piece of furniture? Now, mold, we've got another talk coming up on Thursday specifically on this one subject. This is a potentially serious issue that for those people who have respiratory issues, maybe asthma or other respiratory issues, this could be something when it gets really severe, and this is quite a severe observation we've got on this piece of furniture here. This could be something that could actually affect their health. So when we are doing our inspections of buildings, you would probably walk into that room and detect that just immediately using your sense of smell. You'll notice that it probably smells a bit musty. Maybe it just feels a bit damp and clammy. And hopefully you'll be looking behind furniture that might be up against a wall. If you are able to pull out a bit of furniture, such as this image has taken, or maybe look down the back of a sofa, or curtains which are hanging behind furniture, against windows, doors, glazed doors, all of these types of situations that you'll be familiar with. This is where you're going to be looking for damp and the effects of condensation. And when that gets very severe, it can develop into mold. So what is this? What is we actually looking at here? We are looking at mold on a piece of furniture, but actually we're looking at quite a severe moisture issue in this building. And it's worth asking the question, are our houses becoming wetter now? With the advent of home improvements, with the advent of retrofit and putting in double glazed windows and sealing up all of these things. We're going to cover these over the next two talks. I think that's an interesting question to think about. But the answer is, well, not necessarily, but we notice these things a lot quicker now. Expectations by property owners and tenants have become a lot higher. And certainly with our older housing stock, where former fireplaces have been bricked up, chimneys have been blocked up with no ventilation. Maybe there was a pantry once there, which was used for cold storage, has now just become maybe a utility room, and it's still cold, but it's got no heating in there apart from the residual heat given off by an appliance or something. These areas, and many more of them, are prone to showing us that the building is not managing moisture very well, and that there's a separate conversation to be had there. And it's actually a bigger conversation, isn't it? It's not just about this one observation. You know, we've seen condensation, we've seen mold on this bit of furniture. What actually it should be leading you to is a bigger conversation, a more dynamic conversation about moisture movement as a whole within the building. And if you've got mold like this, to this extent on the back of your sofa, on the back of a cupboard, or whatever it might be, it's pretty likely you're going to be seeing evidence. And even if you don't see it, you should be alerted to be looking for it. And so that is the trigger. The house is telling you it's not managing the moisture very well, and it's a trigger to tell you that there's a conversation to be had with your client. Now, the use of buildings is absolutely relevant to this part of the conversation as well, because, and certainly since COVID, isn't it? Really, the last 5 years or so, a lot of people now, well, initially you were told to work from home. Many people are now gone back to an office type of environment or back into factories and all this sort of stuff. But there are still a very high percentage of people who are still working from home. So if buildings are going to be used in a slightly different way, that moisture management needs to be accommodated equally. And the advent also of expensive wall finishes, such as, you know, high quality vinyl wallpapers and so forth, all of which makes us have very nice homes, but it absolutely impedes on moisture movement and discussion of moisture with your client around the furniture and so forth. So what the building is telling us is not managing moisture very well. The answer as a surveyor is not just to focus on that mold, it's to focus on the much bigger picture of the reduced airflow, colder wall surfaces trap moisture and so forth. And actually, that is something which you will see over and over again. And condensation is absolutely a thing that we are all seeing more and more. So here, something else. This is behind a piece of furniture, not quite as bad as the previous image I've just shown you, but we can see the back cushion of a sofa just in that lower right hand corner of the image, and we see these marks on the wall here. So what is this that we're looking at? And this is the sort of thing that often a homeowner or a tenant might say, I've got damp in my house. What do they actually mean by that? When they say those words, I've got damp, what do they mean like that? It might actually be triggered by an observation like this. It might actually be something far worse with condensation or mold. But if it is something like this can often trigger that phrase. I've got damp in my house. What do I do? Or why is it there? Or how serious is it? And these sorts of things where homeowners and tenants don't really understand. So when someone says that, they're often saying that from first of all, from a visual point of view, with the observation of the condensation or the damp, but also they might be saying it from a sensory point of view, where just like in the previous image, I said if you've got very severe condensation and mold, you might be walking in there to that room, and before you've even started your survey as such, you'll be aware of that. And damp to a non-surveyor, just to the layperson, to a homeowner or a tenant point of view, damp doesn't actually necessarily mean that it has actually got damp. It just means I'm not happy with my house. There's something wrong with my house. Something's going on, and I want you, or I'm relying on you to tell me what that is. And this type of observation is one of those. So we're now bringing in the human element into our surveying, where we've got the diagnostics, we've got the ability to actually measure these things now. And let's face it, there's never been a time better than right now, with access to technology and access to bits of kit that surveyors have in their car for doing these sorts of observations. Thermal image cameras are a really excellent tool. I'll show you an image of thermal image very shortly. So the word damp can be quite emotive, and it is emotive for people who are not surveyors. They're just normal people who are homeowners or tenants, and effectively they are reporting something isn't quite right with my house, and I'm relying on you to find that out and tell me what it is. And the point I'm coming to, and continually will come to, is that we need to look to the bigger picture, into how that house is being occupied. In this case, we've got a sofa up against the wall. The wall's going to be cold as a result of that. So let's think about things like that and not just jump to a conclusion about that it's got rising damp and so forth. Now, here's a very common one, air bricks. Any older building with suspended floors is and should have subfloor ventilation and air bricks. Air bricks are one of those things that are, when they work, they're great. When they don't work, when I say when they don't work, when they are obstructed either by soil, by ground movement, not ground movement, sorry, ground has changed because someone has done some gardening or planting. Maybe someone has done something like putting a patio in, or an extension, or a conservatory, whatever. There's many different scenarios. As soon as you have an air brick which is now restricted in terms of its airflow, you should be really thinking that, wow, I need to look at this a lot more. And what surveyors tend to do is maybe take a picture of the air brick like this, mention the importance of subfloor ventilation, cross ventilation, through ventilation to remove condensation, whatever. You've got all those sort of standard paragraphs in your reports. What often doesn't then get mentioned as the follow-on is, like in this one image, we can see those little holes in the air bricks are partially obstructed. And this clean out and this maintenance of this air brick and a subfloor inspection has got to be done from the inside. This is not something you can do satisfactorily from the outside. With some effort, you might be able to poke that with a knitting needle or a chopstick, and push those stones and obstructions out of the way. But it's not going to be satisfactory. And also, you don't know whether it's actually worked because you don't know what the opening's like on the inside under the floor. When we did the CPD talk on further investigations and subfloor inspections, I showed you some images of what these look like on the inside, and they're not always as clear and as big as you see on the outside. So while we can see that this is partially restricted on the outside, it's likely to be even more so on the inside. So taking that more all-round view, when we are making these observations and this recommendation, we should absolutely be encouraging our client to do a subfloor inspection, because not only does that give the opportunity to clean the air bricks out and see actually what the opening is like on the inside of that wall, if it is the moisture and the ground or the slab underneath the floor is damp, there's very high chance that you might have beetle damage or some form of timber decay, perhaps wet rot or so forth, particularly in the ends of the joists if they're built into the wall. So this gives your client a better all-round viewpoint and observation on the significance of what you're saying, and it's not simply that there is some obstructions to the air brick. The case of obstructions physically because of some form of building, I'm going to come on and show you an example of that. That is far more complicated to solve than this particular one, but this should be quite easy and straightforward for many of you to cover during that. Now, this is the example where it becomes far more complicated. So though you see at the top of the image some plastic doors, this is a turn of the century, so we're talking, turn of 1900s, early 1900s, end of terrace house. And those plastic doors would not have been there. There would have been a window in that, and then the sash window opening has been cut down to ground level in order to put in a set of doors. We can see a concrete surface there, which leads out onto the garden. And directly where you see those doors and underneath and now obstructed by the concrete, there would have been an air brick. And we know there would have been because we have experience of doing this type of survey, and we always know in this particular position we will find an air brick. And if we look at the condition of that concrete, and particularly to where that little flower pot can thing is, the yellow one just by the downpipe, you can see that the lower part of that wall is very damp. In fact, what you can't see in the image is above there is a drainage issue. There's a sink waste which comes over and it floods into a blocked hopper, which has been overflowing probably for many, many years, maybe even a decade or more. That wall is not just damp, you don't even need to be a surveyor to know that that is near enough saturated. It's also visibly damp on the inside. And we know from experience that this is massively high risk. So taking all of that information into its context, we are clearly going to be mentioning all these things that I've just mentioned to you, but absolutely flagging up that a subfloor inspection isn't just, I would suggest you do it. This is absolutely high risk, and you probably would be emphasizing the importance of doing that and not just casually suggesting it done before exchange of contracts. In fact, this is one of those scenarios that you might even want to say something like, you would be unwise to proceed with the purchase without doing the subfloor inspection, because it is such a high risk that you as the surveyor who doing this survey and writing this report, you wouldn't want to accept any liability for what might be in that floor, under the floor, if your client doesn't follow your very sensible advice in doing the inspection. And not only do the inspection to look for defects, but you would probably follow that on with cutting that patio, that concrete surface away from the wall to leave a gap, and maybe you could put an drainage channel or whatever, something to separate these surfaces out such that the wall and the concrete are not in contact. This is really, really important stuff, and it emphasizes our need to think about this from a client point of view and how they might interpret our observations. This is a really common one. And if you're lucky to be doing your survey on a rainy day, you might be lucky and get a picture just like this. Despite the blue sky in the background, actually, it had rained and the gutter was full, not draining properly, and it was leaking through that joint. And you can see the moss and the algae on the joint there. This has been leaking and dripping for some considerable time. And I think we would all expect that where that water hits the ground, there'll be some splashback, no doubt, and damp issues on the wall. So drainage, both drainage from gutters and drainage from downpipes into gullies, this is all so common that it's something that we're all now routinely mention, but we need to mention what the consequences of it are, and not simply go and get your gutters cleaned and so forth. We need to adopt that bigger approach. And here's another example of why. So this is further, not the same building, but further down a different building, where the hopper further up out of the image of this photograph had got blocked. And if you look at the upper part of this downpipe, we can see it's all shiny because water's actually running down the outside of the pipe. And I'm sure many of you will have seen examples like this. And look at that wall behind it, it is soaking wet and saturated to the point which the suspended timber floor on the internal part of this precise piece of wall that I'm showing to you had actually disintegrated and had very severe timber decay and beetle damage, to the point where when the subfloor inspection was done, the boards literally disintegrated not needing any tools or a crowbar to lift them up. They were just that bad that it had created a very severe problem. And all of this is predictable. This is not an unforeseen consequence. This is all stuff that we know, and our job as a surveyor is not just to report on the observation, it is to take the client through the observation, the evidence that we've got, and now what you now need to do next. So thermal imaging, I mentioned earlier how useful thermal imaging can be to making these types of decision making. I've used this image before. It's a really nice one to show how dot and dab plasterboard impacts condensation risk on a wall which has had this type of approach. Now, this is a thermal image. You can clearly see those blobs of plaster where the plasterboard has been stuck on. If this were a photograph of that same image, you would not see this. So this is how thermal imaging can be very useful to surveyors. Don't worry about the numbers. I have to say this, that thermography is a science and it's an aspect of surveying. It's a branch of surveying in its own right. None of us are thermographers. If you want to become a thermographer, there are specialist courses, and the type of thermal image cameras that an actual thermographer would use will cost, thousands of pounds, a few £1,000s as a minimum. That's not what we do. We are surveyors there doing inspection, primarily pre-purchase inspections, and a more basic level thermal image camera will be perfectly good enough to give you nice pictures like this, where you can at least get a bit of information that you can't see with your naked eye, and certainly your client can't see with their naked eye. So this can very much enhance your reporting and your evidence that you can provide to your client. So in this type of situation, if you were doing a survey of this building and over the last couple of weeks where it's really hot, very low humidity, your chances are you may not see the condensation which this is likely to occur. On the other hand, if it were November, December, January time, high humidity, lower air temperatures, both internal and external, higher relative humidity, for example, all those characteristics, this might be something that your client might well then find they've moved into a house and they've got massive condensation problems that you didn't tell them about. And then you'll get an email saying, Oi, why didn't you tell me this? Okay. So what I'm saying is we need to look at this in a more holistic manner. And drafts can also be picked up on thermal imaging. The blue area you see there in the center of this image, this is a gap in the wall and where the roof comes down. This is a barn conversion. And what we're looking at there is heat loss through drafts, not just through damp or condensation. So thermal imaging can be really useful. So if you're already involved in that and you already have a thermal image camera, great. If you don't, do give it some consideration. Now, condensation, as I said, is a very common observation, but again, hit or miss, depends what time of year, and in fact, in some cases, what time of day you're making those observations during your survey. So do be mindful of it, that there are some buildings which might suffer periodic condensation, particularly early morning. Even if some people have got condensation, even if they've got double glazing on their windows, they're not totally immune to condensation. So do keep that in mind. And if you can get into a building early morning, that is your best bet of trying to pick up on it. But what it is telling you isn't simply we've got condensation on this single pane glass or a double pane window or whatever. What it's telling you is that building is not adequately ventilated. It has lowered the heating temperature profile gradient is lowered and the relative humidity is high, which means that the moisture is condensed on that cold surface, which is usually the glass first and the masonry later. So we need to look at that bigger picture. This is another example of it on a ceiling. So we're now getting the message that the building is suffering and the building itself is trying to tell us that it is not managing the moisture very well. And it's the same on the outside of the building, also with paint and with ground levels not being in the right place. And we'll often be making our recommendations of lowering ground levels, exposing air bricks and so forth. All of this is the building trying to help us. What about something like this then? Shriver tubes, we can actually see the original damp proof course there. So you've got the air bricks and that thicker mortar layer there. That's the actual as built damp proof course, yet despite that, someone has chosen previous to doing the survey, earlier than the survey, probably some years ago, putting these porous ceramic tubes in. Complete waste of money. I don't know if they ever work in the Netherlands, which is where they originated, but certainly in our UK housing stock, I don't have any faith in them. And actually, they've just created some flipping big holes in the wall, which will get very cold and then attract even more condensation because of the cold wall and so forth. So what is happening here is that the building is telling us, hang on a minute, I already had a damp proof course. Why has someone come and drill big holes? And now as a surveyor, we've got to be mindful of what the consequences of that is. So the outshot of all of these examples, and there are many more examples, is how we as surveyors are now faced with a moving set of goalposts. And when I've been doing this a very long time. I trained back in the 1980s, and it was a very different world then. Certainly, we didn't have the technology, we didn't have the surveying equipment, we didn't have digital cameras, we didn't have anything. The internet didn't exist, and all that sort of stuff. We're now in a world where all of that now exists, and homeowners and tenants and any property occupier are now looking at their buildings with a very different light to how I was trained and how surveyors are now faced going forward. And I think it is posing additional challenges for the surveying sector going forward. And this is a graphic from a sales advert, which I'm sure all of you probably get inundated with sales things from, buy my products, or on social media, companies doing retrofit thermal insulation. Spray foam is another one. We haven't talked about that, but I have done in previous talks. And this little graphic, I think, is quite useful because it shows us a really good representation of the sort of things that building occupiers are now trying to think about and trying to improve the buildings. Save money through the cost of energy is very high, and I don't think any of us are expecting it to go down. So it's a good little graphic. It gives us an idea of the sort of things which are being touted to property occupiers in a very dynamic way. And as surveyors, we need to try and keep up with this. Now, a consequence of all of this, a sort of a consequence which often is not really considered and certainly not tested very often, is air tightness. I've been aware of this for certainly the last few years, and I've recommended to many of my clients to do an air tightness test. It's not hugely expensive, but it is hugely valuable in terms of the information you get back from it. So an air tightness test is, as you see here, this door arrangement with a massive fan on it is attached to the building. All the other windows and doors are closed, and then the building is put under positive pressure so that you're effectively trying to force it to leak. And looking at using a variety of sensors and some very specific diagnostic software, what the operator is trying to do is force this building to leak, and there is a threshold of a table value that will be able to, so a number can be obtained which can say your building reaches this level of airtightness. And the lower that number is, the closer you get to the building being very airtight. And probably the the limit that everybody wants to try to achieve in the modern world is a passive house, where effectively it has no air leakage and it relies entirely on mechanical heating and ventilation to circulate the air, clean the air, remove condensation, all that type of stuff. But not many houses are ever going to achieve that, certainly not many existing houses. So when people do some of the alterations that we've talked about, put double glazing in, block chimneys up, and all these other things that people do to houses, every single one of these has a consequence on airtightness. And I think if we can, as a body of surveyors, get our head around the science of this and the benefits of doing airtightness tests, I think we can probably collectively learn a lot more about the consequences, because all the things that we've been talking about moisture movement and how moisture exists in a building, how it moves within a building, is all impacted by ventilation, whether natural ventilation or forced mechanical ventilation. So this is something that is, I would encourage all of you to look at, and certainly if you're looking at older buildings, certainly the older they are, the more useful airtightness tests can be, perhaps less useful on a more modern building, but even so, there is a value and information which can be gained from that. Now, another thing which is often not really considered when we're considering moisture is air temperature of the current person living in that building, not your client, but the person who's already there. So you've gone, or you've been asked to go to do that survey. You get there on a day and the house is roasting hot. The heating is up to, as you see on this thermostat, 23 Celsius. Now, you're doing your survey, you're sweating a lot, you're walking around and you're drinking lots of water, and it's a very, very hot house. But you've got no observations in your survey of any damp issues. There's a link there, isn't there? A tangible link that you should be thinking, well, is there no condensation issues and no observations? Because this house is being heated to a very high standard, a very high temperature, and therefore the consequences of those condensation issues are not able to actually occur because of the temperature in the building, the walls are warm and all this sort of stuff. Therefore, if your client who is paid you to go and do the survey, if they do not also heat the house to that very high temperature, could they inadvertently create a damp and condensation issue that doesn't currently exist at the time you're doing the survey? That's really interesting, and it's really worth thinking about. If your client, like the majority of people who heat their houses to let's say 19, 20 Celsius, 18, somewhere around that, high teens, that's not 23. They're going to be getting a very different experience. And the moisture is going to move within that building very differently than it is at the time of your survey. So if you do have the chance of looking at houses which are very hot, keep that in the back of your mind, that it's not necessarily a level playing field for your client versus the person who is currently in that house. Occupancy is also something that we should be reporting on. Occupancy of the building. If at the time you're doing the survey, there's just two people living in that house, in the same building, whether it's a house or flat, if your client has a family, mum, dad, couple of kids, two, three, four kids, whatever, same building, nothing else changes, the moisture dynamic in that building is going to change. It will be different because the goalposts have moved. The amount of moisture, the amount of washing, cooking, showering, all of these things, and just people breathing and being alive is going to change the dynamics of that building. And particularly if the couple on the left-hand image were overheating the building to a very high temperature, and your family who are more struggling with their energy bills might not heat it to the same thing, they might well get a moisture and observations of some of these moisture issues that we're talking about, particularly condensation and mold, that didn't exist at the time you're doing the survey. Worth thinking about, right? It's quite an interesting thing. Showers are a very, an area of everybody's building where there's a phenomenal amount of water vapor, and showers, we all know that bathrooms and showers need to be ventilated. But how often, and I'm sure many of you, how often have you been into a building and the isolator switch is turned off? Or you look at the head of the shower and there's condensation on there. Or worse will be that there's not even any mechanical fan, or there is a fan, but it's on the opposite side of the room and completely useless as far as getting the humidity out. These are things that we should be looking at. Now, interestingly, you can buy an anemometer, a vane anemometer, which has an attachment that you can put over a wall or a ceiling extract fan to test the effectiveness. When fans are brand new, obviously we hope that they all work to some extent, but they do decrease with efficiency with age. They can get dust in them, and sometimes, as I say, they're not even used anyway. So at the absolute minimum, a simple toilet paper test, you could be doing that. Just cut off a sheet of toilet paper, hold it up to the fan, and see if it's at least got enough suction to grip the toilet paper. But better than that would be to get a vane anemometer. And if you're doing a lot of housing association work or a lot of work in that type of environment, it would be very useful if you had that as in your car as part of your kit. I've got to say they're not cheap. They're over £400, somewhere between £400 to £500 for a decent one. So really, it's only something you're going to buy if you're going to use it regularly. But keep in mind what I've just said about internal air temperature, occupancy of the building, and the risk that showers and so forth will be used a lot more and are very high risk to add into that flow. Also, the work from home scenario. I said just now that we're now in a world where people are working from home a lot more. So moisture in the buildings that we are surveying is going to be different to the pre-COVID era when people were not working from home so much. These are all sort of occupancy types of factors that we can usefully include into our surveys. So the building is telling a story, and it's our job to listen to that story. And all the things I've shown you and all the things I've just been talking about, these are all things that we're all used to. None of what I've just been talking about, none of those observations would be new to any of you. But I think what I would like you to think about is how we report on that in our surveys. And I'm just going to finish off looking at how we have that conversation with our client and how we can report on it. When talking to our clients invariably will be looking at all of these things I've said and a lot more in both a practical and an emotional way. The practical way is what's wrong? What do I need to do about it? How expensive is that going to be, and when? Right? That's all the practical stuff. They want you to effectively tell them the the what and when and how much thing, but also the emotional side. People, particularly when they're pre-purchase, they are very emotionally attached to that building and not looking to the surveyor to burst the bubble. So we need to be mindful of how to balance that conversation, the words we use, and being mindful of those things, and also the ability to renegotiate the purchase price. This is all, sometimes that is available to an occupant, or rather your client. Sometimes it's not, but we should be mindful that and have an empathy for our clients. And we need to think about these condition ratings. Personally, I don't do reports which use condition ratings, but I do know that many of you do use a templated report, which maybe one of those ones which uses either traffic lights as color coding and the CR123 groups, CR being condition rating 123. And it's the decision making of how you decide all of the things that we've talked about, whether it's a CR2 or whether it's a CR3, can have a dramatic consequence for your client on how they feel about the building, how they feel about your report, and how they're going to view going forward. So the condition ratings should absolutely be based on evidence that you have gained during your inspection. And that evidence should be, as I've tried to be getting across during this talk, it should be integral to your role as a building pathologist doing the survey. So you're not just making that simple observation and coming to an immediate conclusion, but actually looking at it in a more holistic way, looking at it from a more sort of not just the science base, but I mean that clearly is something that we all do, but actually looking at it from the human perspective and how that might be interpreted. Now, finally, just to finish off, remember that all of the things we're talking about, and particularly as I say, damp is one of those absolute high risk subjects for all surveys and all surveyors, second only to valuations in terms of complaint driven. Remember that your report, once you've signed it, once you've sent it off, it's there and your client is going to have that for years. And it might be that some of these things we're talking about might not come back for years to come. Not necessarily that someone makes a comment on your report days, weeks, months later. It might be several years. Your report is out there in the ether. So when you're reporting on these moisture things that we've just talked about, you can be so much better if you are thinking about it from a third party point of view. If someone was to look at your report, let's say 5 years time, you might have forgotten that you even did that survey 5 years ago, and it might only be a nudge by looking at the photos going, oh yeah, I remember that, da 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 da. But think about that does your report cover what you saw? Not just here's a picture of it, but have you explained in words what you saw and what you think is happening to that building? The building is there to tell you the answers as best as it can do. So have you put that narrative in your report, what you saw, what you think it is, and why you believe that that problem has occurred, and then specifically what you're advising as a direct result of that. If you can cover all of those things in your report, then your report, and that actually applies to all your defects, your report's going to be so much better and more reliable and less risk of having holes picked in it in years to come. So remember, or make the observation, interpret those observations, explain what you see, and make your recommendations going forward. To cover that in that order, and you're probably going to be good to go, and hopefully not get too many or any complaints going forward. It's all there for you to just take that evidence and just make it a little better than it used to be. So there you go. That's a introduction into how we can all look at and report on damp a bit better. Thank you very much. for listening. I think it's such an interesting subject. If any of you do have your own observations or your own experiences, or particularly if someone has made a complaint about one of your reports on any damp issues, then I'll be very happy to have a chat with you either privately or now if you want to ask any questions. But I think hopefully I've covered all bases. And when we come back on Thursday, we're going to be looking at the subject from a bit more detail on mold and condensation issues. Anybody want to chip in? Nope. Okay, well, we'll call it a day on that one, and hopefully I'll see you on Thursday or on a future CPD, and we'll catch up at some point. As I say, you can always email me privately if you wish. Okay, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.